evening, everyone. As it's 5:30, I think let's begin. So welcome to the Administration Committee. Are there any apologies for absence? I don't believe there are.
No apologies from members, Chair. Apologies from Shahjad Hussain, who is a member of the Ethics Panel.
Ah, right. Thank you. Are there any declarations of interest? No? And can I sign the minutes of the last meeting, which have been circulated as a true and accurate record? Agreed? Great. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome Joanna Holmes and Ijeoma Ajibada tonight. And first of all, we have to thank you very much for being on the ethics panel. And we look forward to hearing what you have to say about the highlights of your report and what you think you'll be doing next year.
Is that my microphone's on from the sound of things? Yes, that's good. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the report which deals with our previous year's work, and then EJ is going to talk about continuing work, which is the second part of our report. We had a year of really focusing on the code of conduct and on the directions, not directions to local authorities, but the routes which the Committee for Standards in Public Life was taking on a number of topics, which in the end led to us having two reviews of the Councillor Code of Conduct to try to bring it into line with their thinking as it developed. And we've yet really to see the implications of that practically for the Council, but I'm sure that that will be kept under review as time goes on. We've dealt with, between the three of us, and Shahjad, as you say, sends his apologies, 5 complaints against councillors, of which most were easily resolved, and none were malicious as far as one can tell. And only one of which really raised questions of principle, which were about the debates which currently rage generally concerning freedom of speech and offence amongst people who are not included in the debate for whatever reason, or feel themselves not to be included, or feel themselves to be excluded from that debate. And that is something which I think the ethics panel will be continuing to mull over as we look at our future work. And one of the things which really came out of not so much that complaint, but the discussions which we then had, was how can we help the Council to stay alert to the assumed, or the assumptions which we all make from our position of privilege, that in expressing ourselves as having under freedom of speech, we are in no way, in any way, offending or even making other people feel uncomfortable who don't feel themselves to be included in our assumptions. EJ, you go on.
So for next year, we're going to, in addition to the complaints and the work we've already started to look at, we're going to be looking at what I would describe as some best practice themes or broader themes. And you can find these on page 4. And I think that it's a bit more of a structure for the panel, I think, because we've got this plan here. And so in quarter 1, you can see some of the topics that we are hoping to look at. So we will be looking at the arrangements for the induction, the forthcoming election and induction of councillors, an introductory briefing on employee conduct matters, and then we will receive an update on the appointments for councillors, and I think we've looked at that before. And then it just goes on and highlights other areas that we are going to look at, in addition to the complaints work that we already do. And I just wanted to point out that we have actually had some discussions on the panel about some of these broader themes. So we did look at COVID and the Council's COVID response and the impact of that on the community. We do have ongoing discussions about Grenfell and the Council's response and some of the issues emerging from there. We also considered the Afghan refugees and some of the ethical implications from there. And I think we're still going to look at those and hear from the directors, the heads of services. And we also looked at, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests, we looked at the Council's early diversity and equality. I think it was an early plan. And I think we will receive an update on that as well. And I think that it's useful for us to have a look at some of these themes instead of just being reactive all the time. I think that there's this sense that we do add value, but can we do more? So I think looking at some of these themes will be a good way of challenging ourselves, and maybe possibly engaging. We want to engage with councillors more and with the staff as well. If there are issues that they think that we could be looking at, then we would like to be able to consider them. So hopefully, in all of this and some of the learning, we'll be able to bring that back to the council. But so our plans are outlined there on page 4.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the work this year, because actually I think it's really helpful. It's really helpful having you, and as you said, I know that some of the complaints, etc., can be easily smoothed, and some actually do throw up questions that everyone in the country is grappling with. So on that basis as well, it's great that you're going to be sort of branching out a bit next year, because I think we all need to be a slightly more reflective council, because things change over time, and we need to change with them a bit. And I'm very pleased, I might say, that you're going to be part of the induction of councillors, because if we're ever going to change the culture, then we need to keep doing it, and having a whole new intake is a good place to start, as well as refreshing all our current councillors. Now, I'm sure there are some questions. Comments? No.
Thank you. I read the report and I'm very grateful that we have got a diverse group together, working together. My comment or question is, are you taking the cultural differences seriously when you are faced with cases or cases referred to yourself? Because body language and saying something in different language could mean something entirely different in English or something else. And I'm aware of cases that people are taking advantage of this gap, freak people trying to control others, taking advantage of this cultural differences, taking advantage of the kindness of those who are generally kind because of their background. And they see this as a weakness. How would you deal with that?
Answer that as best I can. Well, I'm not sure that I entirely understand the implications of the case that you talk about, but I think it is, and I'm not sure that we necessarily look specifically at cultural or racial or ethnic or religious differences, but I think that one of the things which is always very clear in the body of material that we get, an individual independent person gets when they look at a complaint, it's always very clear that it has been an unequal conversation in some ways, and that we are always looking for how was this inequality, how did it come about, what were its effects, and does this have an impact on what we should say to the councillor about whom the complaint has been made. As I've said before, if somebody's gone to the trouble of filling out a complaint form and supplying all the evidence, which is often very lengthy, and mapping that against the code of conduct, it's got to be something which they feel very profoundly about. And consequently, one has to look at how was this amount of feeling generated. And yes, in some cases, it is about cultural differences, but more often it's about differences of privilege and power. And it may well be gender-based, or it may well be a cultural misunderstanding, but it is generally based on people having different ideas of how people should behave in a given situation. So yes, we do, but not quite perhaps as you put it.
It's quite timely, this actually. As people might maybe aware, I work in HR as my day job, and one of the things we've been rolling out to some of the senior staff across the bank I work at is unconscious bias training, which I think might be something worth looking at in the future for counsellors. Not as something just to speak to counsellors about, maybe testing a little bit more, because sometimes people have biases which they're not aware of, and you can only really test them out if you probe a bit. So I've got my training tomorrow, and I've done a test beforehand, and they can test things like your views of age, your views of gender, ethnicity, etc. as a whole. It's basically all the protected characteristics, essentially. But I think it's something worth looking at, because obviously, in general, when you approach casework, you need to have an open mind. Don't assume things. And I think, I'd say something like unconscious bias training would be quite a good thing for counsellors and staff in general.
Can I respond to that? Definitely the leadership teams had unconscious bias training, and I think the whole council had. I think we've had a training. I think perhaps you might have just missed it, but so I'm very glad you're doing it tomorrow.
What I'm trying to say is a more scientific approach to it, because the bias training we did have was okay, but I think it was a bit general, and I know these things are improving over time, so I'm saying the stuff I've seen in the private sector can be more specific, and I think it can help. That's just, yeah, I'm not saying it's bad what we've had, but we can improve on it, I think.
Monica?
Thank you, and thank you for a really helpful report. I don't have much background on this before on your work, so 3 very brief questions from me, and then another comment, because I'm very keen around how you see the learning going into the council, because you have work, the leadership team has responsibilities, and governance has responsibilities. So I wondered if you were clear about who you feel does have responsibilities to ensure that new councillors are fully aware of the Code of Conduct and how that's being monitored. I'm not criticising or scrutinising here, I'm just saying that often we have different panels, and I'm keen to know how you see that learning perhaps happening across the board, not by people who voluntarily go to trainings. And also, the second thing was, are you linking into, and this may be an answer from the leadership, into the diversity and equality panel and grouping that was set up last year, and how is this panel linking into that one? And the other thing that I was interested in was that you've given some data, like 5 complaints easily resolved, and I imagine more detail goes to the Audit and Transparency Committee, but I did wonder there whether, what is the data that you keep? Are you managing over the last 3 years to actually look at the themes that are coming up? And obviously I imagine that's informing your 4 priorities, but is there data which is, with it being anonymous, we're more able to look at as councillors and learn from? Or is that just held by Audit and Transparency in some more detail? So I'm just very interested, because your work's so important.
I think the data is actually held by the Audit and Transparency or by legal. I think one of the things that maybe we could reflect upon is whether or not we should compile a kind of digest of learning or cases. I don't know what the legal implications of that would be, but it's something that the panel could consider, because otherwise I think there isn't, it will only be the people on the audit and transparency panel that will actually see what has gone on. So I think that's something we'll have to consider and run by legal as well. With the diversity and inclusion panel, I don't think we are linked with them, although we have looked at the diversity and inclusion. I think it was a strategy, it was an early strategy that we looked at, that we discussed with the chief exec, so that maybe that's another action point for us to do, because it might be useful for us to actually hear from the diversity and inclusion panel and look at how our work complements that or strengthens that. Yeah. And so data, and then you just spoke about, I've forgotten what your first question was. It was about learning.
Oh, it was who has the responsibility currently to ensure that new councillors are aware of the code of conduct, or is it a purely voluntary? Because I imagine that can be the basis of some complaints.
I would have thought that it's members. Yeah, okay.
I mean, as far as I'm aware, all new councillors receive and are obliged to sign, and Laverne is in charge of this, that they have read and understood the councillor code of conduct. How councillors are aware of reissues of it and actually brought to have an understanding of how changes in thinking might affect their lives, I think is another point. And one of the things in which occurred to me when I was thinking about this meeting was that we never ever hear back from the councillors concerned as to what they thought about the outcome of the complaints process. I mean, is this just something which is, you know, they think, oh, that was waste of time, or do they actually derive any benefit from the work and the advice which we give? I've no idea. And so that might be an interesting thing to follow up too.
It's the basis of my question, in a sense that we are all obliged to sign and say we've read, but as we know, that's like the that's the very basis of driving a car. You say, yes, I've read the highway code, and then it's a question of the training. And I think there's been some excellent training this year, but it is mainly of a voluntary nature, and I'd be very interested to see if more obligatory training, which would include the issues that you've also raised, might impact on because it's very resource intensive, your work looking into complaints. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for an excellent report. I was struck by a sentence that you had here, and I just wondered if you could expand on it. And that was that the scale of the challenges relating to conduct have not been as great as might have been anticipated. So I begs the question, what were you anticipating, and why do you think it deviated from that? Bearing in mind, obviously, I've noticed the five, you've noted the five. I wonder if there was a benchmark on this, but maybe you can expand. Thank you.
I think that particularly after Grenfell, and I think, of course, we've been shielded as an ethics panel from much of the Grenfell discussion within the council. But that was, the narrative at that stage was, and there was an element of truth in this, that this was a very complacent and impersonal and non-inclusive culture, and that inviting complaints about councillors' behaviours was going to open the floodgates to everybody in the borough sort of ringing up and saying, send me the forms now. In fact, that didn't happen. We get very few complaints to deal with. I mean, it is, each individual one is, as you say, quite a considerable workload, because we put our best thought into it. But it's not a huge number, especially when shared between three of us. So I think that one of the things which I suppose might be some cause for concern is that the nature of the complaint broadly, while they are very varied in the circumstances in which the complaint has arisen, have not changed very much over the last 8 years that I've been an independent person. And I suppose one might be concerned about that.
Any other? David?
On page 3, under the title Complaints, in the third paragraph you refer to 5 complaints, and then there's one complaint because the event complained about didn't happen, then there's another complaint, then there are 2 cases in the following paragraph at the end of the first line, and then over the page there's one complaint highlighted. Can you just confirm that those are all separate cases and that none of them have got 2 separate points that you're making, and that there isn't one case that has not been covered in what you've written?
That's right. That's correct.
Any other comments? Any other questions? No? Johnny, anything from you? No? Okay. Well, I think it just behoves us to say thank you very much. Thank you very much for writing the report. Thank you very much for coming tonight. And thank you for the work that you're doing and that you continue to do. If we're going to change our culture as a council, things like complaints are really important to follow up and for everyone to understand that, the code of conduct also has teeth. So thank you. And then as a committee, I think that we're just asked to note the attached annual report and future work programme, and note that it's going to be referred to the full council on the 1st of December for information. So thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Oh, Barry, sorry. I missed you.
That's fine. Please don't worry. I just wanted to add my thanks to the panel as well, and say that we began this really from complaints about what might be called integrity violations on the part of individuals, and then about complaints between individuals in terms of conduct. And I think that for the panel to look at individual cases without there being an underlying code of conduct and approach to ethical behaviour, it's impossible to do that. And so that then has rightly drawn the panel into other areas of what the council's business. And I think that's to the credit of the panel itself, but also it means that we as an authority won't just approach things in a, what's this particular issue, let's deal with this. It's looking at the broad issues about fairness, proportionality, and the way in which people deal with each other in this place. I think it's really important.
I just say I absolutely agree with you, and it comes down to our values in the end, doesn't it? And sticking to our values and what we've said. And some of the complaints, what you were saying, where people have different views of things, quite often it's just treating people with respect, isn't it? Both sides listening, discussing, realising where they both stand. But I think Barry's point about how it's got to percolate throughout the whole council in different areas is absolutely spot on. So does the committee accept the recommendation in paragraph 3? Yes, thank you. And thank you very much for coming. Yes, have I forgotten something else?
I read from the hard copy, and at the end of it, there is the reference to David Seedhouse's ethical grid. Have we come on to that, or have we got past that?
I thought we had just
study.
agreed the recommendation.
No,
there had been
it
no
was
more
just somebody
comments
to
and we
explain
moved
it to
on.
me, because I Googled it, and there was a reference to him with health, but it didn't look to be particularly simple, but I'm sure it is. So a half-minute summary would be really helpful, but if Barry's got a copy of it, that would be great.
Okay, Barry's going to send you a copy. because we had actually moved on to the next item on the agenda. Okay, thank you. Right, so can we please look at item 5? And we asked for this to come back, if you remember.
Yes, hello.
Jackie.
When I was here in July, I highlighted to the committee that we'd made many successful grants from this charity, this fund, and the result, obviously, was that the reserve amount had been depleted quite significantly. So I wanted to raise some various issues about how we might manage this fund going forward. At the time, committee members made some requests for clarifications about the types of awards we make, about the criteria that was used, but more substantively, they wanted to have some more options to consider way forward, because the fund was, or the reserve amount was likely to remain depleted for a long period of time. We had at the time suspended the fund for now nearly 2 years, and the fund grows by about 6,800 every year. So we just need to look at further options to see how we manage our obligations under the fund. So unless there are any further clarifications about the types of awards we make, I would go straight to the options page. Is that okay? We highlighted 4 options. Either to maintain the suspension of the fund, use up the existing amount and then suspend it. Option 3 looked at closing the fund, and option 4 looks at trying to merge it with a similar trust. Just to say, my understanding from the legal team who were involved in merging Pocklington and Thomas Huggett a couple of years ago, they've said that that's probably the most complicated option to go for, because we need to find a charity that has very similar criteria and purpose. So that's probably the least likely option to fulfill our kind of obligations under the grant. Yeah, so those are the 4 options. I understand there has been some discussion behind the scenes that maybe perhaps option 3 might be preferable to discuss at this point.
I think let's discuss it as a committee. I certainly came back and said, when I looked at these papers, well, option 3, perhaps we should look at that. You know, perhaps we should say, you know, the money is diminished. We either have to give out very little or nothing. Perhaps we should say, right, well, let's spend, you know, 250 grand. Let's spend it, 50 grand a year. We'll do 5 years and give people you know, what we can, and then close it and say to people, okay, well, now you go to different charities. But I certainly know, I mentioned it to John and he felt completely differently. So I'm very open-minded. For me, that would be a sensible approach, but I'm listening with alacrity to what my committee have to say.
Yeah,
Thanks.
okay.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I think lots of these options are reasonable. I think for me, what it turns on is kind of what the intention was when the trust and the charity was set up, and whether it was intended to be spent in full, or whether the hope was that it would be something that would last for a long time and would be sustained. And I think, slightly projecting my own personal kind of impulse when I think of this kind of thing, I felt that were I to bequeath a fund, I would like for it to last in perpetuity, so that some of the good that is being done by it can happen over a very long period, over 100 years. And in that way, a part of its legacy would pass if the funds had been all spent. But as I say, that turns on the intention when the trust was set up, which I don't know. But on that basis, I was leaning towards option 1 when I first read it. However, like Elizabeth, I'm very open to the committee's views, and it's merely an alternative impulse, I think.
Well, I would like to go back to the beginning because we have lots of needy people in North Kensington. And I did raise the same question back in July. We have families, school leavers struggling, they need help, go back into employment, training. And I'm surprised that we have funds and our communities are not aware of this. I'm really surprised. Instead of talking about closing it down, we should find those who really need this.
I think the question is, Mo, given that there's a finite amount of money and that the interest rates are low, what do you feel is the best option? Do you feel the best option is just to not give out money for a few years, or so that it all builds up again and then later on we can go back to what we were doing? Or do you feel it would be better to say, right, there's a finite amount, so we'll give it out and then close it after a few years? So which option do you go for?
I think we should keep it until we find those who need them.
Thank you.
Eventually.
Monica.
Thank you for coming back on this. If you remember in July, I had some concerns about whether we could include school uniform or not, because it spoke about towards uniforms, people leaving school. However, you note 6 grant or applications. Putting that aside for a minute, but assuming if we could, and supporting very much what Mo has just said, it seems to me that we cannot, at this moment, not be using some of this grant. Families are really struggling, COVID recovery, and I actually think that uniforms for children at school aren't a major amount of money per unit, but they have a massive constraint and they're a massive reason for debt among poorer families, and I've dealt with those as a citizens advice advisor. So option 1 looked very interesting to me because I think it does allow the actual core amount to hopefully continue to accrue some interest. And in fact, I think that small grants can have a massive impact if they go to the right places. And 6,800, Yanni, about 7,000, you know, it's particularly, I think, Holland Park uniforms are about £300. You have a family, you could limit it to about 600 per family and still make quite an impact. And I know we always say, oh, but there's Camden Charities, oh, but in my experience of referring people to these charities, there are quite a lot of hoops they have to go through. And quite frankly, for a period of 7 years, a child, you know, I knew there were 2 brothers with a year between them. It was about £600 every 2 years, and that is your fuel bills and your food bills. So I'm making a proposal here that 6,000, or let's say £7,000 interest, and we're all going to hope the interest will start to crawl up a little bit, but that would give you 100 children. That would give you quite an impact on families who this winter will be struggling with food and heating bills. So if we could, it beggars the question of the original, but if we have given out school uniforms, and if we, or you as trustees, feel that we could look at that as a specific issue over the next 2 years in COVID recovery, then I would make a strong proposal that that keeps the funds going for perpetuity, but it would make the best use of interest.
Jackie, do you know the answer?
I think when it was raised, I was unclear whether school uniforms actually met the criteria here. We certainly don't make grants for school uniforms. Where it got conflated is that during the period that it was suspended, the number of applications we'd received, some of them were for school uniform. And so I think there was a slight sort of mismatch. I think legal, Lorraine here is saying that perhaps under the criteria around otherwise promoting of education, that the only reference to clothing is really for school leavers, so it's around jobs rather than, finding work rather than school uniforms. So I'm not exactly clear whether we could change it toward, for school uniforms, or interpret it in that way.
I think the trustees could interpret it in that way as falling within criteria 6. But as Jackie says, today I don't think we've received any applications to put to the trustees for school uniforms. But I agree, if an application was received, the trustees could exercise their discretion to make a grant.
That does bring me back to the fact that Mo says, and I have some contacts with advisors, people don't know about this trust. So I think we could also perhaps extend it, since young people have suffered so much in the last couple of years and with unemployment. Perhaps I was saying school uniforms, but probably a good suit for an interview and stuff like that for a school leaver could be an essential item, which again, we're talking about small grants which have impact.
So you're saying actually move away from what we can no longer afford from this, which is big chunks of money for various things, and actually let it rack up a bit, but in the meanwhile, advertise what there is, and if people want a suit or they want a school uniform or something, then there's a small amount of money there. That seems quite sensible. David, and then Kim, sorry.
My only point is I think that inflation and interest rates are rising. If we think that it might last forever, it would be worth a very, very little amount, and therefore I would prefer to spend it, disperse it sooner than later.
What option does that mean?
I'd be inclined to go for 3.
3 or 2?
I'd be happy with 3,
okay,
but I could go along with 2.
Just to endorse what Monica has said, I think that's an excellent idea, to give lots of smaller awards and to publicise it. And I think the point that David's already made is that they were incredibly low interest income to the fund, and hopefully that will build over time. But I think if we could promote it and keep it maybe with a narrow focus, we can spread a lot of happiness.
The information about this fund is on the website. That's how we get people. Just to clarify, almost all of the people that apply are from families on benefits. The biggest amount of money awarded is for maintenance, really, for young people in higher education, so from 18 plus, a few younger. I think one of the suggestions earlier was about making the cap even lower, and it would go further. So, I mean, I think that's in keeping. We just have to think about how we reword the website. We could do that to make a lot more smaller amounts available.
Yeah, I think, Maxwell.
This is the headline of this is, do we spend it for today or save for tomorrow? I think option 4 is too complicated.
Yeah.
Option 3, while in the short term would be nice, I think long term, and considering this fund's been going since 1957, probably not the best idea. So I personally think it's between option 1 and option 2, and potentially something in between in terms of this. What Monica's proposed potentially sounds like quite a good idea. Lots of smaller amounts to help more people in general.
So that sounds like we've come to a consensus. Does that give you a clear direction of travel?
1 or 2, sorry.
1 or 2, okay.
I suppose from my preference, just to say in terms of the practicalities, it's been suspended since November 19. It might be best to wait to build up a little bit more. We can specify a period of time. Or we can open it straight away, but then it will reduce quite quickly thereafter. So, I mean, there's not much in it.
Going to go to Monica.
Sorry, that's why I know we're looking between option 1 or 2. I feel quite strongly that we're already seeing all the indications that under COVID recovery and with the current economic conditions for people, that we don't have a moral right to really suspend, but we can say we will only spend so much so that, and I think that's the option we're looking at. I think for us to have looked at this amount of money and said during this crisis that we're not going to extend that, and we've got an energy crisis and we have a general COVID recovery. Inshallah, hopefully in 2 years' time we might be looking at something else, or in a year's time we can review it. But I think the thing I feel strongly about is the council can't be seen to have this amount, which doesn't seem much to a grant-making body, but it's a heck of a lot, £6,000, if you divide it into uniforms or M&S suits to go for an interview. I mean, that's what we're talking about. And I think you've got to consider not the website. Well, I'm sure we can get some data to you, but we've got to get it out to where people are, GPs, you know, the Curve. We've just, Westway Trust, we've just got to get some paper information out there. People are too busy to go searching.
Thank you, Monica. I'm going to ask Barry to come in.
Yes, it seems to me that the purpose needs to be reviewed. I mean, I just looked at 1.2, and you look at the financial assistance for the advancement in life of children and young people who are born here or whose parents have been resident here for 10 years, or who are fatherless or orphaned, but not motherless. And those are in the care and supervision of the borough. And then we go insofar as the opinion, and then we have these 6 things here. And I just wonder how many people are excluded because of these categories A to D, because they may not have been born here, their parents may not have lived here for more than 5 years. It could be that they're not fatherless. I'm sure that's probably possible. I mean, I'm checking as to whether that might be illegal, actually. And they may not be in care of the... So I just wonder whether our Mem and Arts, because you discussed this as trustees, this is not a committee in a sense. You are the committee, but you are the trustees of this. So it may be that if to do what you're suggesting, you may have to change the Mem and Arts of the trust itself. So, for example, you can get provision of financial assistance to study music and art, but not science. Maybe there is a logic in that, I don't know. But it could be, this is because it stems from a historic thing, doesn't it? It stems, so it predates the council even. So it's probably important that we don't just decide on how we allocate the money, but what the money is for, and are there people being excluded from this who we are not consciously excluded? Maybe if it's intended for people that are on benefit or people in care of the authority, and it's exclusively for that, then maybe we should say that. But that would be my...
Yeah. Are we not in danger of overcomplicating it, Barry?
Well...
The amount's quite small if we're going to do it for uniforms and for care leavers and people who are looking for jobs. Can't we do it under this description and just advertise it more generally for a couple of years, and then if we don't succeed in giving the money away, then it'll mount up anyway?
But can we say, I'm afraid you've only been in the borough for 3 years, and we can't give you a uniform, and you've been in the borough for 10 years, so we can give you. Is that the consequence of what that would mean?
That's kind of what the endowment was, right? There'd be other things.
I'm not sure.
I'm sorry, I'd have to probably come to Laverne for this, but you would have to vary the conditions of the the criteria that's been laid out, and I don't know how easy that is to do. I think somebody mentioned you have to go to the DFE to do that. So I'm not sure it's straightforward. That's simply how it was set up when it was set up. I think there's that issue, but I also think we just need to agree what we think is a good amount, because we'll need to state all of this. What would the cap be? How many times you can apply, things like that, in order to make sure that the widest number of people get. I think, from what I understand, I haven't been dealing with this for many years, but is that we've kept lowering the cap. Currently, it's at 2,000. For maintenance, that's a good amount, isn't it, to support a young person whose family are on benefits. If we're going to change it, then I think we just need to be specific about the amount and on what sorts of things we'd be looking at. Obviously, maintenance, it wouldn't make much impact. So it would be on smaller items.
I think it just needs costing Aldridge, Holland Park, what is the current thing, and if you can come back with those kind of details, and perhaps if we took it on as you say, we don't know who's going to respond, but perhaps you came back in 6 months, and on a case-by-case basis, if we saw that the majority of people who were being failed because they lived here for only 5 years, then I think we need to be made aware of that. But I think that perhaps if we keep it as simple as possible, that it does enable a family to claim up to 2, let's say, uniforms at a certain time, and that we know that that cost would cover Aldridge or Holland Park or one of the others, and what we would expect for a decent suit and tie to go and have an interview in, then we are keeping it simple and where people are clear what we're saying. And then if we have the majority of people not living in the borough for the last 10 years, but living here for 5 or 3, which is our housing peak as well, then I think you would come back and we'd ask to change the specifics, but that's how I'd do it.
I think that sounds very sensible, and on the basis of exactly where we began, which is, Monica, you were saying you need to get it out. It's better just to keep it simple and just try and get on with it. Does that give you now a clear enough direction? Is everyone happy with that? No? No?
I would like to add something. We keep saying people on benefit, but believe me, those who are on basic income, or those even who earn 30,000 a year, are really struggling. They are not on benefit, but they are hardly surviving. Now, this is set in 2004. 6 years later, many things changed. Many families who are on low income, not on benefit necessarily, but they're earning, one parent is working, and they're hardly surviving. They should be included. And I support what Barry said, very valid point you've mentioned. We are excluding many people by all these restrictions in here.
Again, we'd have to look at the conditions that are laid out legally and see what changes can be made. I mean, I think that's all I can say, really. But I take your point, of course, the working poor are often the hardest hit.
But actually, just point of information, Mo, they would count to be on benefits because they're probably on child tax credit or working tax credit. So those are the 2 benefits for the working poor that are on zero contracts. So again, you would alert us if there were people who were not eligible.
Okay.
Can I just clarify then?
Absolutely.
So we're looking at option 1. I'm going to go away and see what uniforms cost in local schools, and then we're going to look at some promotional materials to get them out, maybe just to the schools, or we can try and look at it that way. Does that sound right?
Yes,
and should
I think that's what we all agree.
I think we have a challenge in here because this is set for 19 to 25. So how could we,
No,
under 21?
it's just for next
Oh,
year.
okay, all right.
Okay. Thank you. So everyone agreed? Agreed? Thank you very much. And thank you, Monica, because for your contribution this evening. It was really, really helpful. Okay, I declare the meeting closed unless there's any other business. No. Thank you very much for coming this evening.